So we're now going to hear from a panel of leading CEOs. The issues we're going to discuss are the response to the post-election Britain and Brexit, how to survive and thrive in a time of change, data protection and cyber attacks, how to protect your business, and how to increase diversity and attract the next generation of talent to the sector. We have some eminent panellists who include Alan Jeffrey, Chief Executive of M&G Real Estate, Jerry Hughes, who's Chief Executive of GVA, and Andrew Hynard, Chief Executive of Howard de Walden Estates. And our chair for the session is Melanie Leach, who's the Chief Executive of the British Property Federation. Melanie started her life as a police constable for the Metropolitan Police before joining the government in 1988 and then progressing through government to HM Customs and to the Department of Culture. She became CEO of the British Property Federation in January 2015. Please give a warm welcome to our panel and to Melanie Leach. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Simon, and good morning, everybody. Just to start off with a quick update on the composition of the panel. Those of you who know him will have spotted that Alex Jeffrey isn't up there on the stage. I do have Jerry Hughes, Chief Executive of GVA, and Andrew Hynard, Chief Executive of Howard de Walden. And I'm particularly delighted and grateful to Phil Clark, Head of Property Investment at Kames Capital, for joining the panel at very short notice. So thank you enormously to him and looking forward to hearing what he has to say. The second thing probably to say up front for those of you who have been most wanting in this session to understand more about data protection and cyber attacks and protecting our assets is we probably won't get onto those. I think Walter's given us such rich material already, and the other topics on the conversation are so important that we're likely to spend all of the time discussing those. You'll get your comeback when I come out to the floor for questions towards the end of the session if you really want to ask a question about that, but the panel I think is hoping will focus more on the issues around surviving and thriving during change, what all the things that Walter's been talking about mean for them in their businesses, and the critical issue, I think, of how we attract people into real estate going forward. So I'm going to start off with, I guess, what I hope is an easy question for my panel, just to warm them up. And that's really to start with Walter's theme, which I think, as I heard him right, was in essence said, you know, we kind of Brexit hasn't been as bad potentially as we're all expecting, at least yet. We've all moved on. So my question to my panel is, you know, are you feeling, as Walter used the word, relaxed? Are you feeling relaxed? Are you laughing or crying? Is it? Do you think he's right to think that the Brexit hasn't had the impact and won't have the impact that some of us feared it might? Or are we sort of in a period of suspended animation, as it were, when it hasn't really hit yet? Andrew, why don't I start with you?
Good morning, everybody. So if I may, I'll very quickly give you a heads up as to what we're about and our sort of investment outlook, which is very important in terms of timescale, time period. So the Howard de Walden estate is a single asset portfolio, the single asset being 92 acres in Marylebone, the area just to the northwest of Oxford Circus. It includes the best known streets will be Harley Street, which is medical, of course, and Marylebone High Street. And the sectors in which we're invested is, by value, it's residential, closely followed by medical, which is growing at a fair old lick, as residential has been coming off, so medical has been expanding. Then it's offices, then retail, and education and others. The only diversification we get as an estate is across the sectors. So we have no geographical diversification at all, no holdings outside London. It's a private family-owned business. It is an intergenerational outlook, and the family, all they're really interested in is preservation in terms of the value, but critically income growth. They want to see a dividend growth, and we have said as a management team we will deliver them 5% dividend growth. So I've got the luxury of a longer-term outlook relative to many other people, not least the REITs, which are judged on a day-by-day basis. In terms of picking up, I would absolutely agree with Walter in terms of the last 2 weeks. I have noticed a let's just get on with it. There's a job to be done, and Brexit is going to work its way through, and we can't be completely frozen in the headlights. So in our experience, we've had a couple of office lettings, which 6 months ago definitely hesitated. In fact, there was one transaction which was under offer to a serviced office business. They withdrew, nothing to do with the property, but all to do with other external matters and a bit of loss of confidence. In the last 3 months, that building has let, albeit on a floor-by-floor basis, and is often the case. We've got people in the wings now waiting to come in. And so I think that business, in our experience, which is just that microcosm of London, about 92 acres, talking to occupiers, talking to fellow business associates, I think there's an intent just to get back on, albeit in a lower growth economy, which we're all experiencing, but there's been some pent-up demand. We've seen by the amazing take-up figures for central London offices that actually business sentiment is better than it has been for some time, and perhaps better than what one would otherwise expect it to be.
Thank you very much. Phil, if Andrew is sort of taking a very long-term view, I guess you're coming from a slightly different place, because Kames, I think, prides itself on being quite agile and fleet of foot and able to take advantage of market opportunities. How are you seeing this?
Yeah, so to, like Andrew, give it some context. So Kames, for those who may not know, is part of Aegon. Aegon is a large global insurance company headquartered in the Netherlands, and globally we manage 360 billion of assets across shares and equities and real estate. And of the real estate, we've got about 28 billion, which is invested directly, indirectly, and in debt strategies. In terms of locally in UK, there's maybe a theme we want to touch on in the discussion, but we are one of the people who manage a UK open-ended fund, which people would know as retail investors invest in that. And I'll just touch on that a little bit now, because I think thinking of the impact of markets and picking up on Walter's comments, really what impact of political events having on real estate, well, they had a very demonstrable impact on the open-ended retail funds where people can invest in or invest out daily. So a few facts and figures around that. There's 9 of those funds. You saw the headline, 6 of them closed. And that event of risk that was generated at the referendum really hit those funds hard. There was panic, I would say. A lot of money was withdrawn. About 15% of capital was in those funds was withdrawn. And for those that held less than 10% of cash in those funds, that's about sort of 4 to 7, maybe 8 days of liquidity. You can't meet the redemptions in that event. So that had a very direct and big impact on those open-ended funds. We, by sort of crook and bit of design, held deliberately 32% of cash, because we could see all of the downside and couldn't see much upside post the referendum. We were lucky. If the outflows carried on for a long time, we'd have had to suspend like others, but we didn't. But one fact I think people don't pick up on, and it's not talked about in the headlines, and I think this is a barometer to what's going on, is we've had more cash coming in per month post the referendum than before. And I think that would take people by surprise. And we've seen that very consistently coming in. And just sort of to give a flavour of some of the other things we do, this is really picking off Walter's presentation. We focus very much regionally. So we are not investing in the trophy assets in London. We think there's a good investment case for particularly foreign investors to come in. But most of our investment is regional UK, and that's delivering us income returns of typically between about sort of 6 and 8%. And right now, income is what most pension funds are looking for. So that strategy fits well. And another barometer in that is voids in our portfolios across the whole. The UK portfolios between 1 and 4%. So those, I think I'm sort of giving away that actually Brexit had that immediate impact on sentiment, but in terms of our activity, in terms of the returns, and particularly in terms of delivering income, which is fundamentally the purpose of investing in real estate. If you're a pension fund, it's doing pretty well, and it's got a lot of attention, a lot of capital chasing it.
Thank you very much. Jerry, it's GVA's job to read these runes. What's your take?
Well, we're obviously a professional services real estate advisory business, and we operate across the UK. We've got 12 offices, so this is a UK perspective as well as just a London perspective. There's no doubt Brexit has had a major impact on our business. The impact sometimes is actually quite difficult to define, but it has created a degree of uncertainty, a degree of unpredictability. It has created a turgidity in the market. Decision making is much slower. It's quite difficult for us to predict when deals are going to be complete. Any little issue that arises in the discussions sends a tremor through the market, so those people who are making those decisions at that point in time may defer that decision a few more weeks to see how that pans out. So there's overall a backdrop which is making it quite difficult to manage and drive your business forward. So that's the context. Overall, our numbers are holding up as a business. It's our year end at the end of December, so we will hit our targets. But it's been a much more difficult year than we would normally expect. We're predicting equally turbulent year next year, and we're preparing for that. What I would say, though, just to add, really, and I mentioned this, and maybe this is going to come up in a further question, the bigger concern for us is the perfect storm, I guess, of the overall political uncertainty that arises from the current state of government, the lack of an efficient, effective opposition, and the rise of momentum is giving some concerns in some of the projects we're involved in, particularly in Haringey, and overall the broader economic backdrop, our lack of productivity. Those are more concerning to me, I think, than maybe the immediate impacts of Brexit. When you put all three together, it's creating a very uncertain outlook for us.
Thank you. Sticking with you, Joe, what's your take on where we are in the cycle and this sort of issue of, are we sort of effectively on a soft landing trajectory? Are we postponing the end of the cycle and going to have a harder landing at the end? None of you've really talked about sort of the cyclical nature of the industry. We've talked more about political factors. So where are we in the cycle? And is that actually a relevant question in the broader context of all these other factors?
Okay, well, my view is that we're coming down on the cycle, and we will come down further. My personal view, I think 2018, 2019 might take us right down, and then we'll bounce back after that. But we're really on uncharted territory here. We've never had these set of circumstances before, which are disguising the normal market dynamics, really. But I expect us to come down and pick up again 2019-20.
Phil?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. So we're definitely in a cycle because they don't stop. Question is, what's the amplitude of that? And I'd make some reference points on that. For me, it feels a bit like 2005, but we don't know when 2007 is going to arrive. The distinctions I would make around 2005 to where we are now is that there was a huge amount of debt that came into the system in 2005 and 6 and into 7, which has not come in this time round. And some of you may be familiar with some work that we've been doing for the past 10 years on behalf of the industry, but specifically focused on UK banks and lenders generally, under the Property Industry Alliance Debt Group, of which the RICS is a member of that. And we've just published something you may have read about long-term value. It's not a valuation as such, it's kind of trying to derive almost an arithmetic mean, as it were, looking back over past cycles to where we are now and where prices on assets relative to where they've been previously. But out of that research, one thing came out, which was those banks that lent money in the last cycle, those who put the money in the last 2 years, lost all of the profits they'd made in the preceding 15 years. So this time round, we are not seeing the same level of debt coming in, and I think that's very significant for the amplitude of where we are on that cycle. Do I think we're at a high point? Asset prices are elevated. Why is that? Because finance is very cheap and there's a search for yield. Does that mean we're going to see a crash? Well, it's got to be GDP that's going to crash, and globally, economically, things look pretty set fair. I take Walter's point that America may come back to have a bit of a hard landing in the 2020s at some point. So it's almost impossible to predict where we're going, but we're not seeing a big crash ahead. But does it feel a bit sort of squeaky at the asset prices that are prevailing at the moment, yeah, it does. So you've got to be really focused on stock selection and security of income.
Thank you. Andrew, I guess, as a long-term asset holder and business, you're used to riding cycles. So which are the factors that really concern you most around the environment? Is it that sort of broader economic concern that Jerry talked about?
So, well, we can be selective when we enter the market, and certainly we haven't been able to buy for the last couple of years and haven't been particularly keen to do so. But what we have been doing is a lot of asset management and development. So that was well timed with manageable construction costs, a rising, particularly office and also medical market. So we were developing into a stronger rental market and manageable costs. How the cycle affects us is, I guess, around the style of activity. So right now, my view is definitely we're very late cycle. I'm reasonably positive about the risks on value, given the weight of, the very low interest rate environment, the great weight of capital around. So the risk is probably more around rental collapse than capital value collapse. But nevertheless, given the fact that we think it's late cycle, we're naturally de-risking. We've got very little development planned at the moment, and we're looking at other ways, not least our own productivity, in terms of sort of hunkering down, being more effective, more efficient, and dare I say, looking at our own management costs, as well as how we operate more widely. On the question of gearing, very interesting, Phil's point. You look at the REITs now, and it used to be a good sign if they were at 60 or 70% geared. They're now down as low as 10%. And we have consistently borrowed, but a very low number. So we've got about 10% loan to debt ratio, to equity ratio.
Thank you. I want to come back to this issue of foreign investment. Phil, fascinating to hear you say actually more money's coming in since the referendum. And obviously Walter pointed to the fact that the currency clearly had a part to play in that. I mean, is that a one-hit wonder, or do you think that trend will continue? And I've got, I suppose, two things in my mind when I ask that question for all the panellists to think about, but I'll start with Phil. Firstly, do you think the recent budget announcement about the intention to remove the exemption from capital gains tax for non-resident investors will have an impact on that? And secondly, and relatedly, I guess, that sort of broader political question around, the way in which, particularly in property, the issue of foreigners owning large numbers of assets in the UK has become quite a politically sensitive issue. Will those have an impact on that sort of flow of overseas investment into the UK, do you think, in the longer term?
Okay, there's definitely there's a whole PhD thesis in that, so I'm going to try and keep that pretty focused. So international investors, it's not a one-off event. This is something that's been happening for a very long time. I don't see that changing any time soon. You only have to look at the stats from all of the forecasters as a composition of buyers in London. There's currently about 80% of the buyers in London are international. That's not just because currency is cheap, although it's ticked up because currency is cheaper. It's because London represents one of the major centres in the world. The UK is a rule of law which people can trust. It's a transparent market. It's a liquid market. Those are all factors that drive people in. And again, come back to GDP. If you think GDP is going to collapse, you maybe not going to invest anytime soon. So I think, I guess the implication of the question is, will investors pull out their money any time soon? I don't think so, is my personal view. You might see some profit takers, but most of the investors coming in are looking for long-term capital allocation plays, and they're very open about the fact, if you speak to some of the Chinese, they recognise they're buying assets which are highly priced, but this is buying long-term. And one of the good examples of that is GIC, Government of Singapore, has been doing that for decades. So they're very happy to come in and pay what may seem a reasonably high price, but it's a long-term holding. And if you're trying to match liabilities, you tend to be a long-term holder. So I don't see any sort of economic or local market cause for international capital to be withdrawn in a big way in due course. The political aspect of your question, I don't know, we're not exactly inviting people in at the moment in some of our voting and some of the rhetoric out there. But I think the international investors I speak to see through that and see UK as a core location for investing over the long term.
Thank you. Jerry?
I just focus on maybe one aspect of that and broaden it out a little bit about, and I referred earlier to Haringey as a concerning development where politics are actually interfering very much in regeneration, development, real estate, and in fact private investment. And if you think about it, every major urban change project in the UK requires the public and the private working together. And if you have the public sector taking a view, as is happening in Haringey, that they don't want the private sector taking a significant degree of influence and control in what happens in their borough, then you've got a really toxic set of circumstances, which if it grows and develops, and there's every sign that it is actually, which is very concerning. If it grows and develops, then we have a real disincentive to the private sector investing in those complex long-term urban change projects that the country needs. Now we've acted on that project for 4 years, and it's exceedingly soul-destroying to see all that effort go to waste because of a short-term political perspective, which has no direct consideration of the longer-term implications for a particular part of London. And we're already seeing some of our private sector clients thinking long and hard about taking those high-risk positions on those type of projects, and that's a concern. And that will if that carries on out of London to the north, and references made to our regional cities needing to get themselves prepared to attract investment and to join up their thinking. If that takes hold in the north, then we have got a real problem with our regional economies as well.
I'll come back and talk about London versus the regions, or the regions in a moment. But Andrew, I guess, you know, being a central London asset holder and operator, sort of London, the UK being open for business, welcoming of foreigners, spending their money as well as investing their money is absolutely critical to you.
Yes, it's vital. And, you know, our blow, particularly on the retail front, has been cushioned post-Brexit by the devaluation in the pound, without a doubt, with the constant growth in tourism. And naturally, that plays to our strengths in terms of the retail that we've got in the West End. But also, we have medical tourism. So the market for care in Harley Street and around is very much a global market. So there's a core UK domestic number of patients and visitors. But increasingly, Harley Street's name it's got a very good international brand reputation. And we have seen a fluctuation that patients and consultants have a choice globally as to where their clients go, most of whom are self-pay in the private sector. So again, the open for business, the devaluation of the pound has done us no harm at all. I've been in situ at Howard Warden for just over a year, and one thing that I had not had exposure to before, other than just sort of watching from the bylines, was the engagement in London and, in our case, property owners in and around Westminster, particularly the long-term owners, the other estates, the engagement with Westminster City Council. And that has been my observation is it's been a developing relationship. It doesn't always see eye to eye with political differing views, etc., and changing policies, but helped with industry bodies such as the BPF, New West End Company, WPA. It's the property industry is working pretty effectively with local and perhaps to less extent national government, and that's really very important for us. And it means you get a good mood. The big change for us in Westminster, and for a lot of us, I suppose, has been the focus on residential, and the intent to obviously develop significantly the number of houses that are provided in London. We're finding the viability pretty challenging at the moment. But coming back to the political piece, I would say that's been the greatest change, a real focus now on sorting the residential issue.
Thank you. Jerry, thinking about sort of the regions and that, whether you kind of come at it from the Andy Burnham point of view that, you know, there's not two massive war chests to build both the Northern Rail link and Crossrail, or whether you come at it from the point of view of Andy Street, you know, sort of trying to turn that into a positive through his funding commission. I mean, I guess it's not exactly a revelation to say that public finances are stretched and likely to continue so, and that, you know, a lot of the funding for projects that need to be done if the UK is going to be more productive and remain successful economically in the future is going to have to come from the private sector. I mean, how is that going to happen? How optimistic are you that we're going to find our way through that? Is it through devolution of powers and that local leadership? Is it through a different kind of approach from national government? Is it all of those things? Or is it actually the private sector stepping up and saying, you know, we're just going to take this on because we can see it's not going to happen otherwise and it's too important to all of our businesses?
Yeah, there's a lot in that, isn't there? I think there's a whole series of issues there. I think the reason why West Midlands has been really quite successful recently in getting the attention of government is that it's starting to present a very credible proposition that allows the government to realise that this is a low-risk opportunity to become involved. They've worked very well under Andy Street at coordinating their various local authorities and presenting a coherent case. High Speed 2 clearly helps them in the shorter term, but they've got a coherent proposition that's quite compelling, and they've got some major developments on the way, which is actually raising the profile of the city. If you turn though to Manchester, one of the issues in Manchester is they're not quite getting their collective act together, even though they were the first off the blocks in terms of devolution. Under Andy Burnham, there is a risk that they're not bringing yet all their local authorities together in a coherent, cohesive way to present that joined-up perspectives to government. So that there are some challenges in Manchester because it's a region or city region that's been dominated for too long by Manchester City Council. So there are issues there. The other cities are at various degrees getting their act together. The northeast, which was mentioned earlier, I think is struggling in terms of getting all those authorities together. Gateshead have opted out of the agenda, which is disappointing for them. So there's the political dimension. There's getting their act together collectively. The other dimension is that capital is going to be limited, picking up Andy Burnham's point from government. So there is a greater requirement, though, therefore, to make use of available public sector assets, of which they are very significant. When you look at the land ownership held by the public sector in all of those cities, it is very significant. And when you put the likes of Network Rail into the frame around some of the stations, then you've got an asset base that you could really deploy creatively if you have the political support to do that in a way that's attractive to the private sector. So there's a lot of work to be done around bringing those assets together in a coherent way to attract private sector investment. I think the final thing I would say on this is that economically the market is still very turgid in the northern parts of the country. Outside the likes of Manchester and Birmingham, maybe Leeds, when you go further north, the economy is really quite weak. And you certainly go into Scotland, the economy is very weak, and we're seeing that in the work that we're doing. So there are major challenges the further north you go in terms of driving economic growth, which has a direct impact on the real estate sector. So there's a lot to be done yet. There's a lot of rhetoric being talked about, but I think the onus is on the individual cities themselves to get their collective act together and make a very compelling case to government for the government to actually invest. And the government's investment should finally, my final point is, if I was government, I'd be investing all my efforts into infrastructure. Thank
you. Phil?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is one of the key themes in my view looking ahead for the next sort of 5 years, which is political risk. And I think the events in Haringey are sort of noted, but don't seem to get the prominence I thought they might. And I think, you know, questions that people are going to be asking is, are we going back to a 1980s style militant hard left government? You know, and if that takes hold, if that comes in, and if the rhetoric does turn out to be kind of anti-private sector, well, then you've got some questions that need to be answered pretty quickly. How are you going to fund infrastructure? I think the answer's been put forward, we'll borrow more as a country. That's great, but your cost of capital may go up if the markets see you're politically more risky. And if you then start seeing a slowdown of capital coming in that would ordinarily have funded infrastructure projects, that's going to have an impact ultimately on our GDP, and that's not going to be good. So I think there is significant political risk ahead. And I think coming back to Andrew's reference earlier, there has been an impact on markets post-Brexit, but I think it's bigger than just Brexit. I think it's the political uncertainty which leads people to kind of sit and wait and hold back a little bit. We've seen an uptick in transaction volumes perhaps in the second half this year, but apart from that blip of lots of stuff being sold out of the open-ended retail funds end of 2016, early part of 2017, the market just kind of almost, it didn't completely stop, but there was a slowdown in activity as people were trying to work out what does all this mean. And I think the political risk of a change of government would have a pretty significant impact on activity, because people would take time to evaluate really what that means. And I think one of the hard things about Labour, and particularly the momentum part of it, is what actually is their ultimate policy. It's quite hard to evaluate.
Andrew, fantastic project nearing completion in Crossrail in London, but the infrastructure's still creaking. We still need more investment, as we do all around the country. Are you optimistic or pessimistic that we'll manage to unlock that investment?
Well, as you say, the challenge is, in the case of London, is the opportunity and the challenge. The opportunity is around strong population growth. So, London is forecast to grow over the next 10 years by 70,000 people per annum, which is quite phenomenal. And the population going up to 10.8 million people. So that has a big impact on housing. The fact that I've got 100 colleagues in my office, got 30 colleagues who are working on site within the buildings. I think there are two of us out of that total who live within Zone 1 or Zone 2, and I'm one of them. So, we've got colleagues who are travelling in from miles away, and then are facing disrupted trains, overcrowded trains, etc. So we're already seeing that. The impact on Crossrail in the West End will be positive in terms of bringing people in a lot quicker, closer to their offices and to their places of relaxation and retail, but it's going to create a lot of impact on Oxford Street. And so you'll have heard about the Mayor's proposals to pedestrianise Oxford Street, which is going to be pretty fundamental. It's going to be initially closing the section between Oxford Circus west up towards Selfridges. They have got the funding to literally put the barriers across the roads and to do the signage. But what they haven't got funding for, and it was hoped for to be confirmed in the budget, was TIF funding for the transformation of Oxford Street. So that's putting in the public realm and making it a decent, interesting place to be and to shop. So there you go, another example of lack of public government funding, and potentially a botched project where you've closed off the road, but without putting an adequate alternative to the surface that's there at the moment, and a huge increase in volume. So that's just one example. Crossrail, fantastic project, going to open up all sorts of areas of the market and bring greater benefits, but put huge pressure on other creaking areas of the infrastructure in the southeast.
Thank you. Let's move on and talk about our people. So some quite positive messages coming from Walter's presentation, I think, in terms of the UK having a growing population and a growing working age population, the impact of Brexit, as at least as people are talking at the moment, relatively limited in terms of loss of jobs. But notwithstanding all of that, I think there's no doubt that all sectors will be competing for talent over the next period. And the unscientific poll of looking around this room suggests what I think most of us already know, that as an industry, we don't necessarily attract the most diverse range of talent, and we certainly don't bring those through, that diverse talent pool through to senior levels. So how are we going to do better? How are we going to make this a more diverse and inclusive sector, and how are we going to win that war to attract the next generation of talent into the property industry?
Wow. Big subjects. I've gone to an organisation that employs more women than men, so that's very refreshing for a property-related business. I think there's some really good initiatives that are going on across the industry, organisations like Real Estate Balance, good awareness and improving awareness of the senior management of the key businesses. But look at us, as you say, this room is I'm afraid to say, pretty typical of what you'll see across the industry. And it's not for lack of trying. At JLL, half of the graduate take in every year would be male, female, and during the intervening years, that whittled down far more in favour of males. So I think the industry is trying pretty hard. Something like the apprenticeship levy, which has put a lot of focus on recruiting younger people, training them up, and not necessarily going through university, will undoubtedly increase the diversity. And but it's taking a time and disappointingly slow.
Phil.
Yeah, I think I concur with all that Andrew said. I think there's a lot of work going on, but it doesn't seem to be, yet delivering results. Maybe that's just a question of time. But it is. I was at a IPF dinner held in Manchester the other week, and I sat next to the guest speaker who turned around and said it is years since I walked into a room that's just dominated by middle sort of aged white males, and I thought that was just another example of a bit of a wake-up call for all of us. I don't know what the ultimate answer is, but I do lean to the view that if all of the sort of invitation and outreach is not really delivering a change in diversity, whichever aspect of diversity you're talking about, then I don't see any other options than to look at the kind of positive discrimination route. So as a business, we're doing outreach into schools to bring in apprenticeships and those thinking about coming into the fund management industry, and the applicants are almost all male, as one example of diversity. And again, at University of London, we've been doing a lot of work, so I'm a trustee at University of London, we're doing a lot of work to try and change the diversity mix there. And we've, it's a similar kind of message. If it's not happening voluntarily, I personally think you have to think about something a bit more proactive, as it were.
Thank you. Jerry?
So it's cliche, isn't it, that we're in a people business, but we absolutely are, and we in the professional services side of the industry are competing for the best talent. And so we've actually put this item as one of the 3 legs of our whole business strategy. We're really focusing hard on that. And what we're doing is we're completely rethinking our business philosophy, with this in mind, to create a business environment that is as compelling or as attractive as it can be to the best talent. And you need to understand, to do that, you need to understand what that talent's looking for. So we're spending a lot of time researching that and understanding that. We understand that people want to come over for a business that has a very clear business philosophy, a very clear business purpose. So we're spending time understanding what our business purpose is and presenting ourselves to the market in the most compelling way. We are looking at creating an environment where creativity and entrepreneurialism is celebrated. We're giving people the opportunity to, when they come in, to be as creative as they possibly can, to be innovative, rewarding. We're seeking to find mechanisms for rewarding innovation. We are very much putting inclusion and diversity at the heart of our business, rather than having it as some sort of sideshow. It's not something we focus on in splendid isolation. It's very much being brought to the very heart of our culture. Maybe I shouldn't say this when I'm in a room full of surveyors, but we're actually looking to diversify our skill set. So we're looking at bringing people in from other sectors. So we have planners, obviously, because we offer a planning service, but we're bringing in engineers, architects, in some instances even lawyers into the business, of people with different perspective on what we do. And I guess going back to the point of inclusion, diversity, it's interesting that if I took our planning business, which is significant in scale, I think the breakout between male and female is about 50-50. When you go to the surveying side of our business, it's not as positive, shall we say. So there's a big onus on this group really to really think about how we go about getting that balance better between male and female. And we are working hard at working with others in the sector to ensure this happens. But someone mentioned earlier, you have to start at school level and bring people through from school all the way through the education system.
Thank you very much. We're close to the end of our time, but I'd love to take one or two questions from the floor if you have them. So would someone like to ask a question of our panel? Thank you, sir. I think there's a mic coming to you if you just bear with us for a second. And if you could kindly say who you are and introduce yourself before you ask your question. It's just coming through now.
Jeremy Drax, I run my own property company. I've long thought that the popularity of London as a venue for capital is largely driven by the rule of law and the enforceability of it. Other nation states like Russia simply do not have that security of the rule of law. If an extreme left-wing government was to take office and was to start to tax punitively the real estate sector, would you expect to see outflows of capital? And indeed, if other nation states begin to enforce the rule of law and show that rights can be upheld, would you expect also to see capital moving to other capital cities?
Wow.
Yeah, so Phil was talking about it earlier in terms of the political alternative is pretty extreme, and there's a lot of fear. And just talking to our shareholders, what does an extreme left Labour government entail, and what are its implications for property? And property is a classic soft target, which has been hit progressively. But despite that, is quite benign in some of the taxes relative to other countries. So the political risk and that prospect potential of an extreme left-wing Labour government is real, and I think will cause or would cause an upset. We've got huge advantages. We're so lucky at being English-speaking language, rule of law, transparency, etc., and that definitely is a major contributory factor to London and the UK's attractiveness. Other countries are improving in those measures, but we've got the benefit of history and a very well-established property market with, as Phil was saying again earlier, a complete range and depth of international investors. But no, I think that political risk is one of the greatest.
Phil?
Yeah, so he and I have known each other for years and debated these subjects on the IPF board as well, that, property is, and the BPF and the RICS and others, that property just is a very easy political target. And, it's not a party political comment this, but it is a fact that the stamp duty has been increased on commercial in particular. And I guess from a political point of view, the mantra has always been, if you tax property, it doesn't lose political votes. What people never then talk about is what's the impact downstream on cost of doing business in one significant part of your pension fund allocation. It will show up in due course. So I'm not sort of, I don't want to see higher frictional costs in property, but I do think the risk around political uncertainty, as Jerry's outlined, is significant, and I think that could have an impact in making investors not so much take money out, but stop and see what the impact of that would be. And there are two funds I've launched in my career. One's called the Norwich Union Public-Private Partnerships, and the other one's called the Igloo Regeneration Fund, which he knows all about. And you couldn't do that in that changed political environment. It would be very hard to bring in that partnership. We bring the skills and money. So I think it's less about money being pulled out I think there's a question around whether you still have the same skill sets that we need to bring into this country to still come in. But let's hope we have a bit more certainty ahead.
Thank you. I'm going to see if there's one more question. I know we're now trespassing to the coffee break, but it's been a fascinating session, and I just want to make sure that there's no one else burning to ask a question. Yeah, thank you.
Of Basingstoke and Dean Borough Council. I'd just like to commend Jerry's approach on the diversity issue in terms of learning lessons from other sectors and other industries. I quite often use large-scale consultancies to take forward projects. I tend to find that accountancy firms, in terms of providing finance and transformation advice, or legal firms, will have mixed and balanced teams. They will always tend to have men and women, and they will always tend to have Asian and black people within the team, not just in support roles, but in leadership roles as well. So I think there are the opportunities to learn from other sectors, and I think Jerry's approach is to be commended. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm not sure I heard the question in that, but it's a great statement, so thank you very much indeed, sir. I think I'm out of time, so I'm going to wrap up and ask you to join me in thanking our panel very much.